going to say is going to be known to everyone, a sequence of trivia, which I try to organize such that they make meaning, but I'm not going to innovate. I'm not to refer to science. And I'm going to focus on the art of survival. The entire presentation has already been translated to Ukraine as a short paper, and it is available for everyone to look into. Okay. So as an introduction, you know, the war in Ukraine made countless civilians. And whilst we know a lot, and there has been decades of studies of the long-term consequences of traumatic stress, at this point in time, the task for many in Ukraine and those who are refugees is to successfully survive. And I know that even within this survival paradigm, meaning the here and now, how to survive, how to mitigate, how to minimize the traumatic impact of whatever horrible events are going on, and from one week to another, becoming more and more horrible. Much of what has been written and discussed about concerned helpers, you know, how the first responders like psychological first aid, professionals, healthcare policymaker, but the major burden of, as I wrote here, the crossing the sea of adversities on individuals themselves. And that's why I think I want to focus here on survivors or on people under duress, and not so much on helpers. So I'm really going to look into the art of survivorship. Where do I borrow the ideas that form the presentation? First, from narratives, many narratives of people who survived the Holocaust, like Henry Crystal and others, people who survived relocation, torture, and captivity, and wrote about it. And this is a great and very instructive literature. There are also studies of survival strategies that mitigate stress response during major disaster in Africa and elsewhere, but also some experience that we gained here in Israel during waves of terror and destruction that was also formalized in paper. So those are the sources of what I'm going to say. I'm not going to address specific war situations because there are hundreds of those. You cannot address any specific war situation, captivity, replacement. But I'm going to try to outline generic aspects that cut across situations, across war situations. And the presentation is meant to be practical and not theoretical at all, such that those who are actually under duress might be able to identify their experiences and relate to them as they go through. So the plan is to say a few words about war stress, many facets and common elements, then describe ways of mitigating war stress by those under duress, outline critical elements of survivorship, because it's all about surviving here, and at the end offer a tool to assess one's effort efficacy, one's coping efficacy as survival, which is very, very simple, and I hope it might be helpful to practitioners in general. So there are many words here, but the statements are actually very simple. War stress, and we've seen it in Ukraine and elsewhere, is endless number of varying configurations and presentation, from exposure to news, to forced relocation, witnessing death and destruction, cruelty, shattered life. It's very, any number of configuration. However, all war stressors have this in common, several features in common. First, war introduces inescapable life changes among individuals exposed to war. Losses are always loss of life, loss of safety, belonging, social standing, dear ones, unpredictability of what's going to happen next, what is the next step, how we get food, exposure to grotesque death and violence, destruction, threat, not everyone, but for many, and scarcities of different kind of food, of communication, of transportation. So those are really the common elements of war events, wherever they are. Life change, loss, uncertainty, unpredictability, exposure to grotesque threat and scarcity. So we can actually afford to treat war stress as a unified construct, despite its variability. Well, so the list is really truly frightening, but I will dare to draw some general lines on how people react to stress. First statement is as trivial as you can think: life continues. You have escaped and you have been injured, or your life continues, which is, I think, the most powerful statement about survivorship. Life continues. There are major challenges in the new life, and they have to be faced. And it's a feature, it's a characteristic, an essential feature that human beings do not passively succumb to stress. You see hundreds of examples of people are still lying in a stretcher, being transported, but they start to cope by asking, could you give me a phone? I want to call my mother. I want to call my spouse. People cope always. We really do not respond to stress passively. And these responses, mothers, the soothed baby, it's a response to stress. People attempting to inform themselves or extinguishing fires, those responses, they happen without orders, they are spontaneous, and they're ever present. And the point underlying the argument of this entire presentation is that resilience and coping are typical and essential to all forms of living, and they are all ever present. What allows people to endure catastrophic stress? Well, many things, but this mostly from our experience in Israel. So the first thing that people do is to adjust. People adjust to what, there is a new situation, and then you're in a new situation. In Israel, when there was terror in the streets, the schools were closed. Well, you adjust to being without school. First thing is people adjust. Then people map the new reality, try to learn, try to understand, try to get news, and they create a map of the new reality. As the map of the new reality is created, this virtual reality, such as for us in Jerusalem, you knew that there were streets you would not go because they were too dangerous. You just map the reality, really mapping them. Then people shift expectations. They don't expect what they used to be expecting before, but they have expectations and goal. A salient example with us, when we had these continuous terror attacks on buses, when there was a terrorist attack on buses, there were 2 people injured. We were pleased because the regular ones were 7 people would die. So you shift expectation from news, and then you focus on the here and now. And this is not always the case, but I think focusing on the here and now, on the task ahead, is a very strong way in which people help themselves to endure catastrophic. And I put it celebrate living, which would seem inappropriate, but in fact, even under duress, we fight for life. This is a fight for life. And I think and the first opportunity that people have to gather together, they hug one another, is something here that living is not granted anymore. And we celebrate whatever the fact of surviving, the fact of living. And if we do that, if we shift expectations, if we map our new reality, then ideally, life can become under duress from a sequence of failures. I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't connect it, to a succession of achievement. If the achievements are realistic, I need to get milk for my kids, and you achieve them, then you have achieved. So you turn the whole thing into a sequence of successes rather than a series of failures, provided that you really adjust to the new situation. I want to add a short note on fear and horror and helplessness. Those are part of the DSM definition, but they're unavoidable. Or you cannot avoid horror, fear, wherever you say. But it is one thing to be dominated by fear or incapacitated by fear, even when the source of threat are gone, and another thing to be momentarily scared, terrified, or horrified, or other emotions, momentarily. And then it goes away for a while. The endless number of experiments show that extreme fear is usually short-lived. You can go back to Lindman's description of the coconut grove fire, the shift between moments of extreme grief and moments of conversation. So fear is never there as a continuous all the time. And we should expect fear or the extremity of fear to be transient, always. And often replaced by defiance and resolve, wherever you are. And look at these towns of people are continuing to fight, and it's just an ongoing example that really the moment of extreme fear are transient. There are other reactions, exhaustion, despair, grief that are longer, but they also are dealt with most of the time, not by professional, but other survivor by soothing, supporting, and feeling in human context. So being afraid of fear is more damaging than fear itself. When we describe reactions to consequences of war, we often, as professionals, we tell our patients that, it is normal under stress to be confused, disoriented, to worry, to be in shock, to be angry, to have headaches, fatigue. That is normal. But it is also normal under stress to have determination and sharper perception and feeling challenged and involved and pressure to act. And the reaction to stress are always multifaceted. Physiology, yes, fatigue, headache, muscle tension, heart rate, but also alertness and activation. So we're always in this duality of reacting to stress So what people need as they struggle to survive. This is really well known, and I've very little to say here other than information. People always stay informed. The first thing that happens to you, start to when a bomb explodes, you start to assess, where am I, what I'm going, what happens to me with the information. Seeking information is fundamental, immediate, total. We always do that. We seek safety, and that is almost an instinct. You see shooting in a public place, everyone ducks. We seek safety by reflex. That's what we do. What I wanted to emphasize, which is not a natural reaction, but a very helpful way of surviving, is to establish routines of living. In a family of refugees, have breakfast and dinner. Go to sleep at a given time. Reestablishing routines of living as soon as you can. This is extremely helpful and not always natural. And this is one of the ways to reduce the chaotic unfolding on events. So this is something people very well need. And as helpers, you can always think about that as a good advice to families. And two others, the attachment bonds. Always, when there was a terrorist attack in Israel in somewhere, all the phone lines fell. All the mobiles were disconnected because everyone was checking. Where's my son? Where's my daughter? Attachment bonds are almost as important and as demanding as think to yourself. We did a study of communities under stress in Israel. People were more stressed by their children taking the bus and being exposed than by themselves sitting in the same bus, taking the same road. Is always think about attachment bond. It's about attachment bond during war is telling us that we are not really individuals. We are what we are in terms of being part of an attachment network, and make sure that people who are refugee people make sure to let others know where they are, to inform as soon as they can. You actually don't need to tell them, but this is extremely important, particularly for rescue workers. Remember, we had to force people in a hospital during a terrorist attack. Call home. Don't get into work. Don't get into the exciting work. Call home. Say that you're okay. You know, keep your attachment bond network informed. And the last thing is people around us. And a couple of extremely interesting studies, actually from Africa, showing that an ingredient that is most helpful is helping other people. As soon as you help other people, you're much better off, which is really something. Towards the end of this talk, how do we know if we're doing okay? I think I pledged to give you a framework, and this is an old coping efficacy paradigm. When people cope effectively, it doesn't matter how they cope, surrender, flee, efficient coping is characterized by 4 dimensions. First is preserve task performance. You can continue to do whatever it is that you have to do. Get milk for your kids or continue to work as an IT manager. Your work performance remains reasonably good. Controllability of emotions is not that you control emotion, but that the emotions are controllable. You're not flooded by them. You're not entirely and constantly controlled by your emotions. You maintain a positive self-value. You don't hate yourself. You don't. You're not ashamed. You're not maintaining a positive self-view. And finally, I think it's most important, the capacity for rewarding interpersonal interactions. Sorry for the side language. Is just the thing that if you hug your grandson or you have a call from your mother, you feel the connectedness. You're not disconnected. You're not numbed, you know, in the old literature. So preserve task performance controllability. When your clients have a reasonable task performance, they're not controlled by emotion entirely. They think they preserve their positive self-value and their capacity for rewarding interpersonal interaction is preserved. They're doing relatively okay. They're doing relatively okay. And this is one thing that we're not thinking about. They're surviving. And if that's where we are or they are, then regardless of geography, we're doing okay. We're not doing great because we're not in a great situation. We're in a disastrous situation, but we're still doing okay if we preserve their capacities. And this is poesy. When the stark winter of war ends, we are likely to remain perhaps with scars, but less likely remain with open wounds. That is what I wanted to say this evening. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Arieh, if I may ask you a question, and thank you for this great presentation and the great overview. Now we are often, well, as same counts for me in the Netherlands, but also, and particularly, I think also for the people who are not in Ukraine. There's so many people who have left the Ukraine. They turn on the news and they see images, they hear stories. How to respond, or what would your advice be? Or recommendation be how to turn it off, to not shy away from the news at all, what some people do, or they get frustrated, they get upset. What is your advice, how to cope, how to deal? What advice to the people who are turning on the TV in Germany and Poland? There's millions of people who are actually also dealing with the aftermath or the situation that's being exposed on the news.
So this enters under the heading of controllability. You don't want to have anything in your life uncontrolled, and seeking information can be addictive. And this is also part of the routine of living. As you let your kid play 2 hours a day with their machine, you should know that yourself, you should stop. Just listening on and on is not useful. And this should be a statement made to people. I'm recall that in the midst of terrorist attacks, the TV in Hadassah Hospital ER, which is there for patients not to get too angry when they wait for 3 hours or something like that, was broadcasting the size of the trauma, and they exploded. We had to stop it because people were extremely anxious about it. And you know very well, after the 9/11, they had to pull out the images of people jumping because kids were getting so scared. So there is something to say about hygiene of exposing yourself to reminders. This is a hygiene of exposing yourself. You don't want to be flooded by reminders, because then it will be inescapable at some point in time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Some other questions that we may entertain. I saw Marit, maybe you nodded, but should be because you agreed with what Arieh said, or you wanted to ask a question, Marit?
Well, I of course always agree with what Arieh says, because he says it's so beautiful and always so inspiring. So thanks a lot, Arieh, for your great presentation.
I put in very high volume for my wife to listen to that.
Oh, okay, great. So I'm always a little bit, I get sort of quiet when I listen to you. So it's also difficult for me to think immediately of a very, very good question. I was just wondering if you would advise people to help people. There's a lot of people at the moment really wanting to do something for Ukrainian refugees. Here in the Netherlands, we have a lot of people going just by car to Poland.
Okay.
People here, but also wanting to help. I get a lot of requests. I get like 20 emails a day of people asking me, what do I have to do for people in Ukraine or Ukrainian refugees? And what would be your advice on this?
So this is a classical disaster unfolding. In the first few days, or when things are very hot, people are flowing in, regardless of whether they are needed, whether they would consume resources that are needed for others. Sooner or later, you have refugees in the Netherlands. Sooner or later, these refugees are going to be within families, and their kids are going to have, and their kids are going to need something like kindergarten or something like that. Wait for the second phase. There is the first would be honeymoon, where everyone is excited, and then there is a long phase, and we're going to face a long phase of adjustment. Save your energy, plan the adjustment, establish structures to do the less romantic and the less glorious part of the intervention, because this is always when we miss the point. Create networks, ask what you don't rush to Ukraine now just to be there with others, because always the first instinct is to go there. So that will be my advice. Look at those chronic issues that are slowly developing in your own country between families, and try, if you're a family therapist, then it's not easy for a foreign family to live in another family's house for a month. Think about it. Think what you can do about it in the next phase, in the less happy phase. Yeah. Right. It's always a pleasure to hear it.
Same, thanks.
Now turn it back to Iryna. Iryna, I see Sophia has a hand, and then we would bring it back to you, and then you can outline what the order is of the second set of talks / presentation / panel discussions for this panel.
So thank you for the presentation. I have a question. You have been talking about like mapping new reality. I'm curious, what's your attitude to mapping a new reality in virtual reality? Because, for example, like group exposure is widely used for mapping new reality after a traumatic event, for example, in the US. And I'm curious about your attitude to new technologies for coping with these problems.
Yes. The new technologies present many problems. First of which, as we all know, is that reality is subject to manipulation all the time, and you have to select your source of information. The other one is the drama and extreme discourse gets the upper hand, and you always have to filter out, what it is that you're living. I think people should think better of themselves and try to be critical and as smart as they are actually by reading, not to let the drama sweep them. I think this is the most dangerous component of that rapid, quick, dramatic, over dramatized situation. And to that extent, a group should not be formed based on being based on dramatizing situation. I think the best way to interfere with coping, with efficient coping, with resilience, is to dramatize situation, is to lie about situation. And when you're exposed to that through media now, you're really exposed to some of the most efficient ways to undermine your coping and to destroy your coping ability. I hope that I did answer the question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I have a short question as well. We know that after a single traumatic event, there will be a majority of people who will just naturally go back to their normal state, and like from 5 to 10% would have some psychopathology. But what about war? Is this comparable statistics, or how many might have psychopathology after such a prolonged exposure to stress?
So in our lives, the most salient example is the Holocaust survivors. And there's no study showing more than 20-30% of psychopathology among those that we're talking people who've been to concentration camp, people who've been seen murder. I think, and this always amazed me, that there is this upper threshold to the prevalence of prolonged traumatic stress. I refer to it as you can either end a trauma like this, like war, with scars. You will always be scarred, or with open wounds. I refer to post-traumatic stress disorder and other syndrome as open wounds, because they're still bleeding. The trauma is there. Most people will remain with scars, very fortunately.
So we have with us a colleague from Ukraine, Kateryna Ostrovska, and she has sent us her request, which we addressed to our expert from Georgia, Lela Tsiskarishvili. And so Kateryna now will voice out her questions, and Lela would respond to that in 15 minutes presentation. Thank you, Kateryna.
Yes, colleagues, let me introduce myself. My name is Kateryna Ostrovska, and I'm a health workforce optimization and policy workstream lead at USAID Health Reform Support. And what I would like to articulate is that now in Ukraine, we encounter an unprecedented level of violence committed to the civilians. And it's accompanied by the destruction of the medical infrastructure and interference in continuity of care. And under the given circumstances, the large-scale relevant education of the healthcare practitioners, each of whom in the current situation might be a first contact with the sexual violence survivor, and organizing and equipping the mobile medical units assisting in sexual, reproductive, and mental health of the victims appear to be an urgency. And as in the peaceful time, Ukraine made some gains in encountering the domestic violence during the war, we're still on the way to the efficient and exhaustive psychosocial and medical aid to the people in need. And in this regard, I would be asking to share the best practices and in this field, and that might be amenable in Ukraine, and the informational materials targeted both at the carers, I mean the medical practitioners, assistants in the psychosocial field, and those informational materials that might be also useful for the victims and for the survivors of the sexual and other forms of the violence. And thank you in advance, and thank you for inviting me for this event. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kateryna. Lela, you can share your screen now.
Thank you. Is it being shared? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. My name is Lela Tsiskarishvili. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgian Center for Psychosocial Medical Rehabilitation of Torture Victims, and also the President of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims, which is an umbrella organization for 165 organizations in 65 countries that work with torture survivors, including survivors of war. So I will be talking about mainly focusing on violence towards women and rape in the context of war. In the beginning, I'll give a slight outline of difference, distinction of war rape from other forms of rape in terms of its scale, public occurrence, brutality, slavery, ethnic cleansing, and genocidal rape, because it is important to understand the scope and the rationale behind what is happening in the context of war. These are just numbers, so I just want to portray that rape in the context of war is very widespread, and the estimates are enormous. And despite the figures that you are seeing right now, the enormous, huge figures, still the UN estimates that in conflict zone, for every one rape that is reported, between 10 and 20 rapes are not reported. And when we talk about rape in the context of war, this can be sexual violence towards women, children, and men. So in the context of war, it is often performed in public, and it has three main reasons. Audiences, other women to instill fear, other soldiers to promote solidarity amongst soldiers and to show off among each other, and community members to instill fear and terror. And here I'm quoting the Ombudswoman of Ukraine, who gave an interview to BBC 2 days ago, and she said that a 25-year-old woman reported her 16-year-old sister being reported on the street in front of her. Another characteristic of war rape in the context of war is brutality. Sorry, let me get to the next slide. It's still the public occurrence slide, right? Somehow my computer is stuck and I can't move to the next slide, but
yeah, you can find your error on the screen if you.
I'll talk about brutality. Yeah, now it moved, right? Okay. Brutality and slavery. Rape that occurs in war has added elements of sadism, xenophobia, and misogyny. Brutality also occurs with infliction of physical injuries. And during war, it is not uncommon for women to be held captive for the purposes of keeping soldiers sexually satisfied and efficiently mass raping as many women and girls as possible. It also has an ethnic cleansing and genocidal aspect to it. And although here most of us are clinicians and we are not able to talk about genocide. However, it's an ethnic cleansing military tool. It is carried out to prevent births of children belonging to the enemy's ethnicity through death, sterilization, and psychological harm, while impregnating the enemy with children bearing the offender's group ethnicity. And there's also a term that is used that is called gendercide, and this term implies genocide based on the gender. Again, this is a quote from the Ombudswoman of Ukraine, who says that a group of girls was being raped, and Russian soldiers told them they would rape them to the point where they wouldn't want to have sexual contact with any men to prevent them from having Ukrainian children. Why am I giving this very difficult and maybe emotionally difficult to listen to information? Because to conceptually frame that this is part, unfortunately, of every war, and this brutality is something that happens in every war context. What are the consequences of sexual violence? Sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV/AIDS, traumatic injury of genital areas, rectal injuries, oral injuries, risk of unwanted pregnancy, medically unexplained symptoms of urinary tract, urinary infections, and also other infections. What are the psychological consequences? Acute stress reactions, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, generalized anxiety disorder, substance abuse problems, rape trauma syndrome, which is a syndrome specific for rape survivors. And in general population, if prevalence of PTSD is, for instance, and not war-related, I mean, for up to 20%, among a cohort of rape survivors, prevalence of PTSD is 50%, meaning that it is a very difficult experience to recover from. Yeah, I want to emphasize two things: that in the context of war, the rape trauma in the context of war is often of cumulative nature, because it is not only one traumatic experience that happens to the individual. Loss of loved ones, witnessing violence, death of others, forced migration, torture. So there are lots and lots of traumas in the context of war. So rape is one of the experiences. This is a cumulative trauma. And also it becomes a collective trauma, because women who are raped suffer not only the effects of violations on an individual level, but the other members of the community and society are affected by this trauma, because trauma is contagious and it spreads horizontally, vertically. This is just a message I was messaging with a friend from Kiev who was giving a webinar, and I was watching her live. She was giving a talk in Columbia University, and she said there that she was in Kiev, and she was asked how she feels about Bucha, and she said that the distance doesn't matter, that I'm part of all the people who were tortured and killed. So this trauma is being experienced collectively. And when we plan interventions, we also have to be mindful of these elements of trauma being cumulative and also collective. What are the principles of intervention? And now I want to move to more practical issues. It always has to be trauma informed, especially and particularly also in the crisis phase, because the primary healthcare providers, social services, and you mentioned the law on domestic violence, and I've worked recently in Ukraine on assessing the system of protection of victims of domestic violence. And you have a very sophisticated system actually of protection of victims of domestic violence. And this can be used as kind of an entry point and the source, the system to start working with survivors of war-related sexual violence. So law enforcement also, they have to be educated and trained on the effects of trauma. They have to know what is dissociation, what is neurobiology of trauma, because this is crucial when they ask questions, when they take interviews. Here in Georgia, when we work, we are now implementing a project together with Dutch colleagues and trauma-informed access to justice for survivors of sexual violence. And we're working with the law enforcement, and we're basically giving them tips and skills on how to interview victims, why a victim cannot tell a coherent narrative, etc. This is very important, to have a trauma-informed approach. It has to be survivor-centered. Needs of the survivors have to be at the center stage of any type of intervention. And also the needs and the rights of the survivor have to be taken into account of. Often, especially when we talk about forensic services, law enforcement, they neglect the needs, they overlook the needs of the people who have suffered, and the process is very re-traumatizing for the person. There has to be intersectoral coordination. And again, this goes back to being trauma-informed, because the agencies have to cooperate amongst each other. They have to ensure that victim is not interviewed multiple times, that the examination is not conducted multiple times, this comes back to the next point of effective referral system, building a referral and building a trajectory of how the survivor enters the system, who are the first people she or he encounters, what is the further referral. So this process has to be truly thought and elaborated. And the approach, when we talk of a long-term service provision, has to be interdisciplinary. It cannot be just therapy. It has to be an interdisciplinary work of psychotherapists, social workers, maybe legal professionals, medical doctors, etc. Again, is it stuck again? There are lots and lots of barriers to accessing the services for the survivors. And as I mentioned previously, in the context of war, from one reported case of rape, there are 10 unreported cases. And there are lots of barriers, including children who are raped often do not know who to speak to and refrain from doing so because of shame. This also goes, same counts for adults, right? In some countries, there may not be a trusted way to report rape at all. Shame and stigma associated with rape. And I think this is one of the key barriers. Families can be ostracized from their community following the reporting of a rape. In case of males, fear of being seen as a homosexual, feminine, or carrying HIV/AIDS make male victims of rape very unlikely to report their experiences. And we have to be mindful so that in the context of war, males also become victims of rape, and it is even more difficult to reach them. There's an international protocol on documentation and investigation of sexual violence during conflict, and it provides basic elements to multi-sectoral response. And I'll just show you, this is from the protocol. It's an annex of the protocol. So you see, this is how they understand the intervention and how it should be planned and implemented. So at the center, everything is the survivor. And we have the medical side, which addresses primary health concerns of the survivor, obtains a complete medical and sexual violence history, performs sexual violence examination, provides safe abortion if that is something that is needed. And that is a very crucial thing. And I know now it is a problem for Ukrainian women who are rape victims, especially those who are in Poland. And it is emerging as an ongoing problem. The law enforcement, which provides security and protection to survivors, interviews survivors, takes statements. And you understand why these two units need to be educated and sensitized on the effects of traumatic experience, because these are the services that are the first ones to have access to the survivors. So it is crucial that they do not inflict further damage to the person. Then we have the legal judicial system that also takes survivor statements. They review the evidence provided by the law enforcement and the medical services and work with survivors to build case against the perpetrator. And we have psychosocial and mental health services that provide adequate support, accompany survivors in courts, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in my next slide. And they perform outreach to community members who are also affected. So this is a process, and at the center of this process is survivorship. Everything should be tailored to the needs of the survivors, and the whole intervention has to be informed by the rights, human rights of the person who had suffered rape. I'm going to talk a little bit about GCR. This is the Georgian Center for Rehabilitation of Torture Victims. So we are a non-profit organization, and I'll speak a little bit about our model of intervention and the process of how clients come to our center and how we work with them. We're a non-profit, non-governmental organization. We cooperate with state authorities, also non-state authorities, within our center. And we are a long-term rehabilitation center for people who have suffered severe forms of traumatization, torture, sexual violence, war trauma, detention, etc. So we are a multidisciplinary group of medical doctors, psychiatrists, social workers, psychotherapists, child and adult psychotherapists, as well as general practitioners. And we have general practitioners sitting in our office, general practitioners and gynecologists. This is because the type of trauma we deal with is also very physical. So people have been injured on a physical level as well. And it is important to have medical doctors in our team and part of the same discourse within the team. So this is, so the client is in the center, and there's a team working with the client in a multidisciplinary modality, and all the cases are led by social workers. Then we have the process of intervention. There's the building a referral system is the key. I mentioned it earlier. So we have a referral system that brings people to our center, and then we have a referral system where we send people if they need additional legal assistance, or they need, for instance, inpatient treatment, or they may be some addiction issues, etc. So we have a very coherent referral system. When they come to the center, initial stage is the assessment. Then the entire group sits together, this multidisciplinary group, it develops an intervention plan, which is agreed with each client individually and based on the planning of the intervention, and then informing the client. The informed consent is signed, and the process of working with the individual starts. We almost always, whenever we have a chance to work with the family, because when we talk about traumatic events and severe trauma, it is not isolated, and it is not sterile, so it spills over the family. So when we talk about torture survivors or survivors of sexual violence, we talk about secondary victims, which could be their family members. We always work with children, because if they have severely traumatized parents, and I'm mindful of the time, I'm going to go more quickly now. I'm just looking that I'm a bit over. So working with children is central in our work. We always document cases. Sometimes, if we are cooperating with human rights NGOs to work against the perpetrators, we do documentation according to Istanbul Protocol, which is an UN principle on documenting torture. But also we do documentation on cases of sexual violence, and we accompany the survivors in the court process. And often our clients are, we are expert witnesses in the court cases against the perpetrators. And we basically, this is what we do. We explain why the survivor did not report immediately, why the narrative is not coherent, why are there omissions in memory, etc. Working with other agencies. In the context of war now, when there is a big amount of Ukrainian refugees in Georgia, we started working in the communities, doing initial screening to see, because mainly people that are in Georgia are from Mariupol. So many of them lived through the horrible experiences. So we're doing screening of those people who should be referred to our office. And then we monitor and evaluate our services. Just this one point that I want to emphasize, because I think it is important. When we work with survivors of extreme violence, these are the therapeutic modalities, EMDR, trauma focus, CBT, etc. However, I want to emphasize that often our work does not go beyond safety and stabilization, because the clients that we are seeing, they need to be first be stabilized, and they need to be in the they need to feel safe. Until they feel safe, it is impossible to start trauma-focused work with them. Now we are hearing anecdotes from Poland, from Romania, from Moldova, that very well-meaning psychologists are going to refugee camps and trying to do psychotherapy with clients. And this is, yeah, it's a red line that cannot be crossed. So first, it is the crucial thing is to provide basic support and to help the individual to feel safe. We don't have time for this, but it is also crucial to take care of ourselves, because we do, and probably all of you in this call are doing and will be doing more and more difficult work. So if we do not take care of ourselves individually, and if your agencies and organizations don't take care of yourself, yeah, you will burn out very soon. These are some of the international instruments and documents that are freely available online. The first one is the International Protocol of the Documentation and Investigation of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Second one is JASC WHO Guideline on Gender-Based Violence Interventions in Humanitarian Assistance. The third one is also WHO Guideline on Clinical Management of Rape Survivors. And also you have to be very mindful that sexual violence and gender-based violence increases dramatically post-conflict. So this is something that you will also be dealing with. There will be a lot of veterans coming back from war, communal dynamics disrupted. So you will be dealing with more and more sexual and gender-based violence. And it is very important that you are well prepared for addressing that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lela, for that overview, that very instructive and passionate overview. Iryna gave me the microphone back. Okay, Iryna, that's okay. Now, with the remainder of the time, I'd like to first, I know you have questions and there's a panel discussion. I'd like to give the word first to Bob Ursano in Washington in the United States, if that's okay, Bob, to go with you first, and then circle back to Lela or Kateryna with some additional questions. But maybe first, some comments from your end, Bob, if you wish.
Eric, just to comment, working backwards overall, I mean, the presentation on war-related rape is just detailed, stunning, and extremely disturbing. I much appreciated the opening and difficulty here, characteristics of war-related rape, and to be able to put it in context as how that can differ from things of date rape during peaceful times. Vast trauma with tremendous shame, trauma that is meant to affect an entire community, not just an individual. The outline of the systematic approach to it is clearly critical. And also the issue that I heard most loudly is the importance of the usual kind of work we do is later, not early on, and certainly not until safety is present. So the work early on, maybe perhaps related more to what Dr. Shalev presented, and Arieh presented an outstanding presentation outlining the experience of survivorship. In war-related rape, the first experience is that one has survived it. And then how does one begin to reconstruct and maintain this sense of value of oneself in the face of having survived? And often in the cases that I've heard, which are not many, but they are always tremendously difficult, one hears how the individual tried to maintain a sense of self during the experience. And the ways they try to maintain it itself can be difficult to hear. And yet it's important to find those, because that's where the coping of survivorship was happening, even during the rape experience. Outstanding presentations, Eric, and I congratulate both of your presenters on difficult topics focused on what's actually happening right now.
Yeah, thank you for framing it so coherently and so wisely. Thanks for these statements, Bob. Now circling back to Georgia, we have Jana Javakhishvili with us, and Jana Javakhishvili was also invited to give some comments to Lela's presentation. Jana?
Thank you very much, Eric, for handing to me. Indeed, it was difficult to listen at the beginning, all these details, and this provoked in me associations. Actually, after 2008 war in Georgia, we never in public discourses, never discussed war-related rape or even killings of women. And only in 2018, two Georgian journalists who were investigating homicide and femicide, let's say, they just brought the numbers and appeared that that's 1,600 women killed during the 2008 war in Georgia. I wonder, this conspiracy of silence, which is in our society, probably that's about this huge shame that society could not defend their women. And I wonder whether this is helpful at some point to keep this issue silent, or it does not help to heal the society, the community. So that's a very important question to me, because probably the silence somehow is helpful, especially at the beginning. On the other hand, probably this huge shame and probably feeling of being guilty, probably it still lives within our society, and probably it fits this ongoing gender violence and domestic violence, which Lela warned us. So that's just a question, that's under question mark for me. Where is the balance to speak or not to speak, to reveal or not to reveal, and how to address without acknowledgement actually of harm? Because if this is not in public discourses, then this harm is not acknowledged. And speaking of justice, probably this acknowledgement of harm is very important. So that's my reaction.
Jana, thank you. Also, Bob, and as we are listening to this, it's not only the rape, but it's what's said during the rape that is extremely disturbing, right? So what we just heard and what we just witnessed, those verbatims, what were said during the rape, are on top of the rape itself, which is highly traumatic, are making it extremely difficult for us also to bear witness to, and to listen into, and to kind of leave us puzzled what the impact of that is. Now maybe circling, and thank you, Jana, for making that comment, maybe going back to Lela, or maybe reaching out to Joshua, a colleague of Bob Ursano, also to echo someone's voice, but I'm not forgetting you, Yeva, and also Arieh. Maybe first, Lela, if you wanted to comment what you just heard from Bob and Jana.
I just want to add an extra dimension, which I intentionally left out in the presentation, but I think it is important to have it separately, and maybe you will also have a separate meeting about this. It is very painful, but very important also to talk about children who are being raped. And this trauma is very different from child sexual abuse in times of peace, because in regular life, child sexual abuse is different. It's from an insignificant other, the child knows, so it's a different dynamic. And what we're witnessing here, we started seeing at GCRT, for instance, now, these days, children and adolescents who are being submitted to physical violence, sexual violence. So this is another big dimension of this conflict, and we have to be, as professional community, be prepared, as painful as it might be, to address it and deal with it.
Yeah, thank you. Did I put you on the spot, Joshua, by asking for a response, or are you okay to reflect or comment on what you just heard?
Sure, Eric. I very much appreciate the presentations and the talks, and also struck a bit to some degree by, I'm reminded of conversations with colleagues who are in Ukraine and working with people in Ukraine, and some of the tension between trying to hold on to a sense of resilience, or the sense that many things are transient, versus addressing concerns that people have. This sort of tension between wanting to see the strength and the perseverance and the ability to move through the transient nature of many responses, as Arieh highlighted, with the desire to acknowledge the struggles and the difficulties. I think it's a real tension and a balance. And of course, many of our emotions we don't necessarily address anyway. Most things we sort of put on the back burner, and they kind of simmer out at some point. So which things to bring to the front and to address, and helping people to differentiate those things, I think is one of the things that I'm struck by, and I find myself thinking a bit about as I hear some of these very powerful presentations. And again, very much appreciate what's been shared.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua.
Is that this is the first time in my memory that atrocities are documented real time. You usually hear of massive rape in historical books like World War II. And this is a unique opportunity for organizations such as ECNP, traumatic stress, and others, to advocate for documenting and bringing rapists to trial based on the evidence. This is really, if there's one thing that is good about in the presence of media in the Ukraine conflict, is that you get all these facts out there and that you can act on them. They're not cold, they're not 10 years old. And I believe that we should all push for not just therapeutic action, but at a completely different level. Public action, legal action. I'm surprised that the names of the rapists are not yet on the web. There is a lot to do, and this is really a unique opportunity that I have not experienced before.
I was asking about how to work with this hateness that people have a lot now in West Ukraine, and we have a lot of refugees from East, and it's a high level of hateness to Russian people, and sometimes it just make people freezing and not move. They stuck in these emotions.
So the word is hate, right? The word is hate, H-A-T-E,
hate.
right?
Yeah, hate.
Two sources of information. One is from Edna Foa, when she taught us her PE method. She mentioned that anger and hate are the most difficult emotions to treat in CBT. The other is a bit more romantic one, or from my own past. He was discussing with my psychoanalyst a moment in which I wanted some porter tried to block my car, and I was, for an instance, I was going to crush him. The thought, I'm going to kill him, and so I brought it to my therapy. Of course, you bring everything other than what's really important. And the answer was, my analyst was Holocaust survivor himself. He said, yes, I know the feeling. This is what happened to us in Germany when we saw the Nazis march in the street. And the worst that came up is to have the paranoia outside collide with the paranoia inside yourself. Because when the two paranoias collide, it's a very bad situation. And there is something about horrible events, about terrorism and things, that they tend to change us into haters and into people. And this would be, for many people, inescapable. So when the paranoia from the outside, evil from the outside, touches the grain of aggression that we have inside, said my psychoanalyst, we're doomed. So better not let them meet one another. And hate is obviously a problem that may survive the war. I mean, people hate for generations. So the best is to make it known that evil changes us into evil people, and we should do everything to resist that. If I were to summarize the reply.
Thank you. We will echo these words a couple of times for its wisdom that you put in those, Arieh. Thanks.